the disorder starts to interfere with their daily functioning and cause significant distress. There's often an element of counting and symmetry. Hi, this is Jim Brillon, and welcome to this YouTube channel where we talk about all things mental health. Today I'm going to be talking about OCD. There's been a lot of interest in OCD and as far as understanding what it is and the various forms of it. OCD is an anxiety disorder that's characterized by people having obsessions and compulsions. That's why they call it Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder. Obsessions are basically unwanted thoughts or feelings that intrude into a person's mind. They're things that are unwanted, can often be very disturbing. A compulsion is a behavior that a person does to try to manage the obsessions. And they can become repetitive, and the interesting thing about compulsions is that they give short-term relief, but actually long-term they further ingrain the disorder. And there's lots of reasons for that, including that every time that somebody, let's say they check the stove to make sure they turned it off, every time they check it again and again and again, they start to doubt themselves a little bit more, and they have to keep checking. So when somebody's diagnosed with OCD, it's when the disorder starts to interfere with their daily functioning and cause significant distress. The fascinating part about OCD is that there are multiple forms that some people may or may not recognize as OCD. Some people might be obsessive about cleanliness, having to wash their hands multiple times, or when they're taking laundry out of the washer, if the clothes touch the edge of the washer, they have to put them back in and wash them all over again. So you can see that these obsessions and compulsions can be very time-consuming, and they can be debilitating for people. Often people get into checking the door. Did I lock the door? Did I turn the stove off? And people can have multiple forms of OCD. There's often an element of counting and symmetry, where somebody will have to do some behavior twice or 3 times or 5 times. And the numbers like 2 and 3 are often important because they represent some form of symmetry. 2 is 1 and 1, right? And 3, some people unconsciously think of that as symmetry because it's sort of like a triangle, and if you cut a triangle down the middle, there's 2 equal parts. There's some very interesting ways that the mind conceptualizes these things. People can have a fear of losing their loved ones, something terrible happening to their family, and they might have to check on them multiple times during the day. Sometimes they have intrusive thoughts, obsessions about unwanted desires like sexuality. They might have a fear that they might sexually abuse somebody that they love. And this can interfere with their functioning, in that if you have an obsession that you might sexually abuse your sister or somebody in your family, then they avoid hugging them or touching them or ever being alone with them together. They have no intention of acting out on these thoughts, but the thoughts keep coming, and they're very intrusive and very disturbing. Often there's a religious theme to these obsessions, and we can think of that as scrupulosity, a fear that you might do something to offend God. That shows up in ways like every time you close the door, you have to close it twice because the mind tells you that one opening and closing of the door might invite in some evil intent. So if I do it again, then I'm making sure that I don't offend God. To the rational mind, to many people, these don't seem to make sense. And this is one of the reasons why OCD can be so debilitating, is because people think that they're crazy or there's something wrong with them. There's a form of OCD called harm OCD, where people might obsessively worry about harming another person, maybe killing somebody or killing themselves. They might worry about committing suicide, killing their family. Again, they have no intention of acting on these thoughts, but they just can't stop the thoughts from coming. They might have obsessions about worrying that they're going to be unfaithful in their relationship, or that they are going to sexually abuse their children, or cheat on their spouse. Contamination is a big form of OCD. People worried that they might be contaminated by germs, or their food might be contaminated. So those are some of the obsessions. Worrying about dirt, or needing to order things, keep things in line, arranging things in a perfect way. And what happens is that these obsessions ultimately lead people to doubting themselves. And the interesting thing about the compulsions is that they actually tend to reinforce the obsessions long term, rather than helping to assuage them. Ultimately, OCD is a struggle that people have with uncertainty. They can never be certain that I checked the door, or I did this, or I did that. They can't be certain that they're not going to act on some impulse. And a large part of helping people overcome OCD is helping them to become comfortable with uncertainty. An interesting fact about people with OCD is that there are actually some variations in a person's brain. If you think about the way that our brains work and we process information, we might think of some problem that we're trying to solve, and we think about it this way and we think about it that way, and come up with a plan and a strategy, and finally we go, okay, that's the answer. Okay, cool. And now you put that thought aside and you move on to the next thing. In many people with OCD, once they get to that part of certainty, all of that information goes right back to their frontal cortex for reprocessing again. So they never get that sense of resolution, of certainty. The symptoms of OCD often appear in childhood or adolescence, generally before the age of 18 or 19. And there can be some associations with childhood trauma. Even people having a streptococcal infection. This is something that, especially when it happens when they're young, can lead to something called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders, and it can actually change the form and function of the brain. There is treatment for OCD, and it basically comes down to cognitive behavioral therapy and something that we call exposure and response prevention therapy, which means exposing people to the things that make them anxious in incremental ways without having them go back to the compulsion, and doing that in a state of a relaxation. And gradually people get more and more comfortable with that anxiety-provoking stimulus, to the point that hopefully it doesn't create that problem for them. Hoarding is another form of OCD, and people can hoard in different ways. Some people might buy and keep things that they already have. You might look in their pantry and find that they have like 30 cans of beans because they just keep buying them and stocking up on stuff. Some people might refuse to throw anything away because there's some emotional or cognitive attachment to it. And people can be obsessive about collecting things. So there are various forms of OCD. Some of the more recent forms include something that people refer to as relationship OCD, where a person is constantly worried about whether they're in the right relationship or their partner is the right person. Do I really love them? Do they really love me? It's a relatively new conceptualization of OCD, and it actually looks an awful lot like insecure attachment. In fact, having an insecure attachment is often a precursor to having a diagnosis of relationship OCD. So there's a lot of information, and if you're struggling with OCD, or you have a loved one who's struggling with OCD, there is help. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. Like and subscribe so you can get notifications, and I'll talk with you again later in another episode. Take care.